Hey y'all, it's me with another edition of my Year of Reading Women. For my 10th novel, or not 10th novel, but 10th book of this year, I chose a classic, Beloved by Toni Morrison. I was not prepared for how good this book was. I knew it was good. It's a classic. It's Toni Morrison. It won a Pulitzer Prize. I knew it was good, but I just wasn't expecting to like it as much as I did. So a little background about Toni Morrison. She is probably the most well-known Black author in America. There's a picture of her there. She is, like I said, a Pulitzer Prize winner. She's a Nobel Prize winner. She was friends with Oprah. She also won the highest civilian award, which is the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Barack Obama awarded that to her, I think in 2011. I could be wrong. She passed away a couple months ago, in August of last year. It is now March. So just about, oh gosh, math in my head, about 9-ish months ago. And upon her death, her interest in her work was sort of renewed and never really waned. There was always an interest in her work. But I think when she passed away, there was just an uptick in like book purchases and just people wanting to read. People like me who realize, I've never read Toni Morrison before. Maybe I'll pick up a book of hers. If you haven't read Toni Morrison, Beloved is a great place to start. It is probably her most well-known book. It is the book that won her the Pulitzer Prize. It was published in 1987. And it is the story of a runaway slave named Setha. She was a slave in Kentucky and she ran away to Ohio. The story takes place about 18 years after she left Kentucky. And she's living in Ohio with her daughter, Denver, her youngest daughter, Denver. Her two sons have left the house and are out on their own. And the house is haunted by the ghost of her other daughter, who died when she was just a baby. This other daughter was buried in a cemetery, and her headstone, all Setha could afford to write, she wanted to write Dearly Beloved, but all she could afford was Beloved. So the baby's headstone says Beloved. At the beginning of the novel, an old friend from the plantation in Kentucky, another slave who has also escaped, shows up on Setha's doorstep. His name is Paul D. They strike up a relationship. He gets Setha and her daughter Denver out of the house for the first time in years. And when they come back, there is a woman sitting in front of the house who calls herself Beloved. And Setha and Denver actually are convinced that this is the dead baby ghost in human form come back to them. And the story goes on from there. There are flashbacks of back when Setha was a slave and back when she escaped and gave birth to Denver on the run. Paul D has some flashbacks. And just the way that the present story and the flashbacks transition between one another is just absolutely seamless, which I think is really difficult, and it really is a good example of what a skillful writer Toni Morrison is. Now, after I read the book, I did some more research. I looked on SparkNotes. I watched some interviews with Toni Morrison. I watched some analyses on YouTube, and a lot of them give some stuff away that I feel like if I had gone into the book knowing it, basically they tell you how the baby dies. And I feel like had I gone into the book knowing how the baby dies, it wouldn't have been like, when I found out how the baby died, I was shocked and heartbroken, and it was gut-wrenching. And it was a really huge moment in the book. And I feel like had I known what it was before I started reading, it wouldn't have had that much of an impact for me. So I was really glad that, like, all I read before I started reading the actual novel was this little blurb on the back. So I didn't know what I was getting into when I read it. And I'm actually really glad for that, because it just made the book so much more powerful for me. It does deal with, obviously, slavery, but also the psychological effects of slavery, which was inspired by a real event. The death of the baby was inspired by a real event that Toni Morrison read about in an old newspaper, which made it even more shocking when I found that out. But yeah, it deals with the psychological effects of slavery. It also deals with personal identity and finding your own personal identity. Obviously, when slavery was happening, these people had their identities taken from them. There were no records kept about, what part of Africa they were coming from, or even their genealogy. Like, when a child was sold and the parent was not sold, they didn't keep records of whose child belonged to who and who your grandmother was. And so their identities were completely taken from them. Even the character of Paul D, who doesn't even have his own name, he shares the name with two other men who are Paul A and Paul F, I think. And then Setha, whose identity is completely tied to being a mother. And even Setha's mother-in-law, Baby Suggs, who didn't even know her name. She had a name that the slave owners just decided to call her. I think it was Jenny. They just decided to call her Jenny, and she was like, I don't know why. And so when she was freed, her son, Setha's husband, purchased her freedom. And so when she was freed, she didn't have a name. And so she said, my husband called me Baby, and his last name was Suggs, so my name is Baby Suggs. But yeah, so it definitely deals with issues of identity. It deals with motherhood. Setha is, like I said, her identity is very closely tied to being a mother. And her maternal instincts are what leads to the climax of the book. It also deals with grief. The haunting of their house by Setha's dead baby. This woman calling herself Beloved, who shows up at their doorstep and convinces this grieving mother that she's her long-lost daughter. So yeah, there are some universal themes in there, things that everyone can relate to. And I say that because there was a time, like all through my 20s, when I really questioned what books I was allowed to read. And by that, I mean, like, I'm sitting here almost 34 years old, and this is my first Toni Morrison novel I've ever read. Honestly, it should have been read when I was in high school. But I struggled with, I would see a book and it would have, Black people on the cover and it was written by a Black author. And I would think to myself, oh, I'm not allowed to read that. Like, if a Black person saw me carrying around that book, they would be like, why? That's not for her. Why is that white girl reading that book? And within the past few years, I realized that that's not really a thing. Like, stories are meant to be shared, and they're meant to be shared with people who are different from you. And by reading or listening to or watching stories about people who are different from you is how you gain empathy for other people, and how you can get a glimpse of experiences that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I think it's really important to read or listen to or watch these stories by people who have different experiences and who think differently, and who just are different from you. And so I've been trying to do a lot more of that. And this book just really fit in well with my year of reading women, because it is, obviously written by a woman, and it's a story about a woman and about women's issues like motherhood. Toni Morrison doesn't really consider herself a feminist author, which doesn't bother me. But a lot of her stories are centered around women's experiences. But yeah, I'm really glad that I, at the last minute, chose to include this book in my year of reading women, because it is such an important book. I think everyone should read it. I think it should be assigned in high school, honestly. It does have some adult themes like sex, but I mean, teenagers are watching gratuitous sex on TV all the time. So why not have them read a classic piece of literature? Just because it has a little bit of sex in it doesn't mean they shouldn't experience this book and get to learn about it and get to really dig deep into it. And like I said, after I read it, I dug a little deeper into it. I looked at Spark Notes. I actually found this really great channel on YouTube called Thug Notes. It's a guy dressed as a thug. He's an actor. But basically he just summarizes and analyzes classic literature, and it is absolutely brilliant, and I love it. So definitely look up Thug Notes. He does have a Beloved episode, which is wonderful. But yeah, I'll definitely be reading some more Toni Morrison. Faux show. Because it's like I said before, like, she's a winner of all these important awards, so in your mind that she's a good author. But until you actually read one of her novels, you just don't know how good of a writer she is, how skillful she is. Everything in this story, like, the timing was perfect, the pace was perfect, the word choices were perfect. Like I said, the transitions between past and present were seamless. It's just a really well-written story, which I think just makes it even more important for people to read. But I got this copy at the used bookstore. They always have a copy there. I'm sure if you have a used bookstore in your area, you'll be able to find it very easily. I'm 100% sure that any bookstore would have it on their shelves, even if you don't have an indie bookstore in your area. Barnes and Noble is bound to have it. It's a very easily accessible book because it is so well known and it is such a classic. So yeah, definitely get your hands on that. Give it a read. And then I also encourage you to do what I did and just delve a little deeper into it. And there's actually a really good interview with Toni Morrison. If you just type in Toni Morrison Beloved into the YouTube search bar, it's a video, excuse me, it's an interview from the 80s when this first came out. The interviewer is another Black woman. I don't remember her name. But I'll find the video and I'll link it in the comments, because I really, really enjoyed hearing Toni Morrison sort of in her own words talking about the book. This edition says right here, with a new foreword from the author, but there is no foreword in this. I don't know if they forgot about it or it doesn't look like it was torn out, but there was no foreword, and I think I would have really enjoyed a foreword from Toni Morrison. But anyway, that's literally my only critique for this book, was that this edition that says it has a foreword didn't have a foreword. But yeah, I'll be posting about this on Instagram after this video uploads. And if you're interested in more of my Year of Reading Women, you can follow hashtag my Year of Reading Women. And you can subscribe to this channel. If you're interested in just all the bookish stuff I'm up to, you can follow me on Instagram at Shy1Persephone. But I will see you next time with another video. Bye.